magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul
Good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. An exciting Sunday morning, walking through the book of Ezra. I know you are truly amazed, and we have an exciting morning planned today. Yeah, the crowd roars and they're jumping up and down in their seats. If you're not at home, you can't see all that, but just take my word for it. So if you were with us last week, and most of you were, we know that the rebuilding process for the temple was not without interference. We know that some letters were sent back and forth from Babylon to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem to Babylon, and several of the local leaders got involved, and it was a fairly contentious time. And, well, all of that hullabaloo, that caused about a 15-year delay. Now, don't ask me why it was 15 years. I'm assuming that when they said snail mail, they really used snail mail. You know, they just taped that letter to the back of the largest snail they could have and said, go to Babylon, or go to Jerusalem, or wherever you need to go. Yeah, that sounds really not, maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, or perhaps hyperbole, if you will. So where we're going to start today is after a guy named Tatnai sent a letter to the king. Now, we got our timeline slide, so we're in the 22-year period, which we're going to get out of today, in the first 6 chapters of Ezra. And so I keep it because it's fairly important to the whole process, at least for me. And then we got our timeline for the leaders. And again, you know, Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Haggai, Zechariah, those were the Jewish leaders that were involved in making the decisions related to the construction of the temple. Zerubbabel and Jeshua so much more. Haggai and Zechariah played a crucial part because they're the ones that lit the fire under the people to get them to start working again, because they were kind of in turmoil. But like I said, that whole back and forth and what are we going to do now, that lasted about 15 years. So one of the events that impacted this more than probably any other after Cyrus was when Darius became king of Persia. And that was noted in Ezra 4:24. He was coming in behind Cambyses and Smyrtus, and Smyrtus was nothing more than a puppet of somebody who got found out. And so Darius eventually came to power, and so he was more like Cyrus. He had global thoughts. He had ideas about here's what's going to happen with this. And so in order for him to accomplish his goals, he sort of had to figure out how to make everybody play nice. Another key player is Tatnai, whose name's not on here, but he's the governor of the region where Jerusalem is located. Now, I didn't bring a map with me this week. I probably should have, but that region was fairly large. And so it came from below the river and kind of made a triangle coming off of Babylon all the way down to Jerusalem. So he had a fairly significant piece of property that he was the governor of. And then there was another guy, Shathar-Bozenai. We'll see his name in a few minutes. He was probably Tatnai's secretary. I don't know. And there were other governors in the region. So there were governors within Tatnai's region, and there was some outside of that. And so, you know, there's a bunch of people that think they have a stake in the process. But the temple construction did not restart really until Haggai and Zechariah got involved. This is something you may not understand or realize, but we are approaching the period at the end of the Old Testament, just before that 400-year period of darkness starts. So what we're seeing, this stuff that we're reading in Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, these were all the things that were happening really just before the Old Testament kind of closed up. And so that 400-year period began shortly after this. Now, when I say shortly, that doesn't mean 3 days. It could be 25 or 30 or 100 years. But these are the last pieces of recorded history we have out of the Old Testament. So that should put that into a frame for you so you can see, well, where's where we're walking through the Old Testament? And we're almost at the end of it. And so, remember those things when you think about that. The next bunch of leaders that came into power, they said, well, who authorized this? Who did this? That kind of stuff. So when Tad and I came and talked to Zerubbabel and Jeshua, they said, we have permission. We came with permission. Yes, it was 1,000 years ago. It was 15 years ago. But yes, we have permission for this, and we're going to press on. So Tad and I sent a letter to Darius. However, he let them continue to work. So they were able to continue to work while they were still working all of these different problems. So here's where we start picking up now in chapter 6. And it said, Darius the king made a decree, and a search was made in Babylonia in the house of the archives where the documents were stored. So he went and looked in the archives that were kept in Babylonia, and guess what? He couldn't find anything. So what did he do? He just said, go tell them they can't build. No, he didn't do that. He kept looking. He kept looking. He says, in Ecbatana, the citadel that is in the province of Media, remember we have a blended organization. We have Babylon, we have Persia, and we have Media. And so each of these had their capitals, and because these kings moved around within the framework of that capital structure, records could be kept almost anywhere. And it says, a scroll was found on which this was written. It says, a record. In the first year of Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. He said, let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices were offered, and let its foundations be retained. Its height shall be 60 cubits, and its breadth 60 cubits. With 3 layers of great stones and 1 layer of timber, let the cost be paid for from the royal treasury. Now, not sure that last thing actually took place, but we'll get through it. Now, so he looked in the different capital buildings. He eventually found it. And so I wonder how he found it. Well, God was in charge. They could have had the thing buried somewhere, and he would have still found it because he wanted to find it. And so it even had dimensions. Now, when you think about the size of the temple, I know you have probably committed all of this to memory, but the tabernacle, I'm going to give you the measurements in cubits. And I don't want to go into the whole discussion about short cubits and long cubits, but a cubit is not a cubit is not a cubit. But anyway, the tabernacle was approximately 9 by 30 by 10 cubits. In other words, 9 wide, 30 long, 10 high. And if you want to find that, it's in Exodus 26, verses 15 to 25. Solomon's temple that he built, according to 1 Kings 6:2, was 60 cubits by 20 cubits, so 60 long, 20 wide, 30 high. Ezra, it says that it was 60 cubits in breadth and 60 cubits high. So we really don't, or 30 cubits high. We really don't know exactly. And what I think is it's because they went back and said it was to use the same foundations. Typically, when you use the word breadth, it means side to side. So it could have been 60 by 60, but since it said maintain its original foundations, I'm thinking it would occupy the same footprint as Solomon's temple, but it would have been twice as high. Now, if you care about cubits, a regular cubit, or what they say is a short cubit, that's 18 inches. But if you have a long cubit, it's 21.6 inches. Now, don't ask me How I know this? It's on the internet. And if it's on the internet, you know it has to be correct. So now verse 4, it talks about the construction of the original edifice that we gathered in 1 Kings 6:36, which was Solomon's temple. The work was to be financed by money from the Persian treasury, but I'm not sure that got carried out at that point. And interestingly enough, it says it's supposed to be, 3 courses of stone and a course of cedar beams. Well, that's exactly right out of 1 Kings 6:36. That is exactly how Solomon's temple was built. So somebody was paying attention, and when they put this thing together, they basically mimicked as much as they could Solomon's temple. And so that's kind of interesting. Now, it says, we're going to remember some of this because it was back in chapter 1, 100 years ago. He says, but also let the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that is in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and brought back to the temple that is in Jerusalem, the one that's being built, each to its place. In other words, take all of the things that were taken out of the original temple, take them back to Jerusalem with you, rebuild the temple, and put all of the fixtures that I can give you back in. Now, there's a good possibility that everything wasn't there, that anything they could have reused, they would have. But I suspect from the numbers we saw, they probably got most of them. And he says, you shall put them in the house of God. Now, therefore, Tatnai, governor of the province beyond the river, Sheshbozani, and your associates, the governors who are in the province beyond the river, keep away. Let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. So he said, don't interfere. Don't mess with things, you know. And of course, the letter from Darius back to Tatnai confirmed what they told Tatnai. We were authorized to build this. And you remember about decrees that are made by the Medes and Persians. Once a decree is made, it cannot be reversed. So this was going to happen no matter what. They found the original documentation and said, hey, this is what we said. You know, that's where they're going to get. Now, if there was any introduction in the letter back to Tatnai, we don't really have that because he just basically starts off and says, you know, put all this stuff back. It just tells him to keep away and not interfere. And it tells the Jewish leaders, elders, they were running the show. One thing that would have done is if anybody had come calling to try to interfere with the construction from that point forward, Tatnai could chase them away or whatever he had to do so there wouldn't be any interference because the work was to go on unimpeded. Good word. All right. He says, moreover, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of this house of God. The cost is to be paid to these men in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province from beyond the river, and whatever is needed, bulls, rams, sheep for burnt offerings, to the God of heavens, wheat, salt, wine, or oil, as the priests of Jerusalem require, let that be given to them day by day without fail. So here's what he said. Give them the money. Take it out of the taxes that you're extracting from the people in your region. Take it out of your bank and give it to them so they can continue with this building, whatever they need. And give them all the animals and everything else that they ask for to make the temple functional and operational. So I thought, wow, pretty cool, you know. He says, give them to them day by day without fail. Why? So that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. There we go. We just found the rationale for what he told them to do. He said, you give them everything they need so they can make sure that I stay healthy. That's what he said. We want the king and his sons protected, therefore they're going to pray for that, and you're going to make sure it happens. Okay with me? I'm okay with that. And also, I like this part. I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled on it, and his house shall be made a dunghill. Now, let me give this to you in real plain English. It wasn't going to be pretty. Really, what he's saying is that, they interfere. Well, we're going to. One thing you should know is that the Persians and the Medes were not very kind when it came to capital punishment. They were pretty aggressive, and they were pretty mean. And so, knowing that, whatever he said, I think I would have hated that. The one thing I noted that the instructions in Leviticus for bulls, rams, and lambs out of Leviticus chapter 1, verses 5 and 10, and the sweet and the salt come out of Leviticus 2:1. In other words, the things that are being called for, somehow Darius knew what they would need. Don't know. Could have been Daniel. Could have been some other person who would have been advising him and saying, here's what we need, because we know that the main drivers were in Jerusalem and Tatnai's back in Babylon. And so, and who knows, well, not Tatnai, but Darius is back in Babylon. Tatnai is somewhere in the region around Jerusalem. But he wasn't there, but somebody had to tell him these things. I don't know if he had a copy of the letters of Moses. He may have, very possible, because they did have a lot of records in their archives. They were actually pretty accurate, all things considered. So you can think about that. But this Darius is basically saying, I want the community of Israel, the Jews, to be on good standing with God, and I know the priests will pray for the king and his sons. So that's the whole kit and caboodle right there. It would not have been unreasonable. If you remember Jeremiah, he urged prayers for the Babylonian rulers when many of Israel's citizens were under his authority. This isn't any different than what we've been told today. We're told to respect and do the things of the people who are appointed over us. That's the same rules that we live by today. And so this really wasn't anything new. Paul said this in 1 Timothy 2 about respecting Roman rulers. It just kind of everything seems to tie together. That's an interesting thing when you think about it. God's plan back in the Old Testament carried all the way through the New Testament, through Paul and what he wrote, the letters he wrote, and what the gospel writers confirmed many of the things that we read in the Old Testament. Why do we study history? So that we can see the validation of God's rules through the Old Testament carried through to the New Testament. We study the history in the Old Testament to help us understand what we're being asked to do in the New Testament. It makes sense. So go from that point. The whole death thing in verse 11, that's just, basically that person's going to be killed and his house is going to be turned into an outhouse. There you go. You can see all these outhouses sprung up all around the place, well, you'll know what happened because somebody in there did something they weren't supposed to. But these people were pretty sadistic. And so impaling victims on pointed posts and things like that, that was fairly common, and it would induce a very lingering death. So the people would be there and they would see the process of death. But this was primarily the Assyrians and the Babylonians who started this process. The Persians, they took a slightly different approach. Their approach was be a little more benevolent, and the people will make it easier for the people to surrender quicker. When you're really getting people riled up, sometimes they don't respond. Well, if you're feeding them honey, you might get a better response. And that I suspect that process was very practical. But it has to really do with enforcing justice. But if you read the Persian historians, you find out they're really acquainted with impalement and crucifixion for punishing criminals. Herodotus, who was a Greek historian who recorded a lot of Persian history, he speaks of Persian crucifixions, and though they were like the ones with Julius Caesar, and actually the crucifixion process with Caesar, it didn't start with Jews, it started with pirates. They had a huge problem with pirates, and they were the first ones historically to actually be crucified. We don't read any of that in the Bible, but in the history information we have, they really used that to punish pirates. But what they did is they killed them first, then they hung them on a cross, so it was an advertising campaign. So what happened was they would execute these people and they would string them up on a cross so everybody could look there and see, well, here's the last guy that crossed Caesar. And so it's a big advertising campaign to discourage people from doing things they didn't want them to do. Not a very pretty picture when you think about it, but it is what they did. Later on, they started crucifying people alive and using that as the vehicle to kill them, which was and could be a long drawn out affair. So, and we know from the crucifixion account of Jesus, those records that we have, we know it was, not fun times for anybody involved. All right, let's go on here. What this letter continues to say is, may the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put out a hand to alter this or to destroy the house of God that is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree, let it be done with all diligence. He's not messing around. He's just saying anybody that interferes with this construction, anybody that tries to damage this construction, from this point forward, they're going to be punished. Well, temple was rebuilt, and somewhere around 70 AD, it was torn down again. And given the decree that Darius made, I would have thought the people that tore that temple down would have been punished infinitely. And some of them actually were. But, of course, they weren't in charge at that time, and so some of the rules they made didn't apply. But he says, then according to the word sent by Darius the king, Tatnai, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-Bozenai, and their associates did with all diligence what Darius the king had ordered. Do it my way. Don't do it my way. It's the highway. That's what my dad always said. Do it my way or it's the highway. And it says, and the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. Zechariah really wasn't Iddo's son, but we'll get there. They finished the building by the decree of God of Israel and by the decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes. We'll talk about Artaxerxes in a little bit, king of Persia. And this house was finished on the third day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. So, from the time the exiles left until they actually got the temple built was 22 years. That's a long time. It's a long time. Verse 12 says, in a nutshell, anybody who tries to get involved, they're in trouble, and they'll be punished with the punishment that was listed in verse 11, the whole beam thing, and, dunghill house. Yeah. And obviously, Tatnai and all the other Persian leaders, they're going to do exactly what they would be told, because I am sure that they would not have been exempted from the rules. If they had interfered and it got back to Darius, I'm sure they would have been punished. So without further harassment, the work got moving along. Still a lot of work, because we don't know how many stones had to be recut. We don't know how much timber had to be moved from the cedars from Lebanon, all of those kinds of things took time. About 5 years from the time that they actually got restarted and got things finished up. With the help of Haggai and Zechariah, aided by the Persian rulers, they got the project finished. If you read Haggai, you'll see much of this stuff in Haggai about what he told them and what God said and those kinds of things. Now, verse 14 in here, when you see the names, it says, the Jews prospered through the prophesying about all of these names that pop up. You ever seen a post office that's new? It's got a plate on the front of it. It's got the list of everybody in the government and everybody who was responsible for building that post office. Well, this is kind of the dedication plate for the temple. These are all the people that were involved in getting this done. And it names the Persian leaders who were instrumental in getting the work accomplished. They did pay for it. They did approve it. They did support it eventually. So they got credit for it. So there's 3 administrations of kings, 2 prophets, Israel's governor and the high priest. Notice that they don't really give a lot of credit back to Tatnai, but he's just a bit player when you're talking about the king. Artaxerxes, that kind of raises questions. If you remember, we talked about Artaxerxes back in chapter 4, and I, at the time, said, well, this could have been a title, it could have been things, but Artaxerxes was in power shortly after, and we'll see that in due time. We'll see where he is involved in the process. But it's not until verse 7, and it may be a while to chapter 7. It's probably going to be a while till we get to chapter 7. I don't think it was the Artaxerxes that was mentioned then as having a letter written to him and things like that. It's because we read Artaxerxes' name in the next chapter, and because he's in the reign of kings with Darius and Xerxes and Artaxerxes, he had a part of the process. May have been further down the road. I'm not sure. We know that it took 22 years to build the temple from the time the exiles left, and then 58 years in the middle where that's where Esther falls. And so what we have is an 80-year period approximately of time, a time block. And at the end of that 80 years, beginning in Ezra 7, that's when Ezra goes back to Jerusalem with another group of exiles. Not nearly as large as the first crew that went, but that's when he goes back. So I don't know how old Ezra was. I'm not sure I could find it. I did a little bit of preliminary looking, but if he did, sorry, clearly, come on, we'll be there eventually. Clearly, if he'd been born when the first group left, he'd be 80 years old when he made the trip. So there's a good possibility that Ezra hadn't even been born when the first exiles left Babylon and went to Jerusalem. Don't know. There's some things we just don't have the answers to. But we'll get to that point sooner or later. But because these kings are kind of listed, Cyrus, Darius, Artaxerxes, kings are excluded. For example, you don't see Cambyses and Smyrna. You don't see Xerxes between Darius and Artaxerxes. So they're not all listed. There was interference from Xerxes. And so we'll get there. As a matter of fact, we'll get there probably quickly. But that name is missing from the list of names. But don't know. Some things we just don't have. But again, 22 years, but only 4 or 5 years to actually get the work done. And so Adar, when the month when this was finished, that's the 12th month on the Hebrew calendar, assuming that there was no extra month for the solar timetable. In other words, I think we talked about this one week where some years had 12 months and some years had 13 months. You know, a certain period of time went by, and then they would have this extra month inserted to correct the solar calendar. They knew that it wasn't precise. So 12th month is around February or March on our current calendar. Now that's good to know because we'll have some other things that pop up. So let's move on. He says, and the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. And they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their divisions for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. All right. So, what do we know? Well, what we know is that the dedication for the rebuilt temple wasn't for the original temple, but if you go back and look through the Old Testament, Solomon built a temple, there was a dedication, but Josiah made some extensive repairs, and it was rededicated under Josiah's reign, and Hezekiah also made repairs, and it was rededicated again. So there, up to this time that I can find, there had been 3 dedications, so this would have been the 4th with the rebuilt temple. It's interesting, it talks about the joy of the people. In other words, they were excited, they were happy to be home, and so they're happy. Verse 17, I got to fix this thing, it's going to make us crazy. Verse 17 talks about 2 kinds of sacrifice. The one for dedication would be the burnt offerings, and that comes from Leviticus chapter 1. And all of the edible meat of those animals would be burned up. In other words, it would be consumed in the fire, and that represented total consecration. In other words, we're restarting everything, so what we're going to do is we're going to start everything over, and we're going to get it all started again. So we're going to fix all this, and it's going to be all good, changed. The sin offering would have been appropriate because what they were trying to do was close the curtain on all the long years that they'd been suffering in exile because of their sins. So what they want to do is they're celebrating God's forgiveness. And now I said 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, so there were 700 animals sacrificed. Do you know how many were sacrificed when Solomon dedicated the temple? There were 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep that they sacrificed. That's in 1 Kings 8:63. So 144,000 animals were sacrificed at Solomon's dedication. Think of the time. It wouldn't be some kind of fire compared to 700 for this dedication. There's no, now in Solomon's dedication in 2 Chronicles 7, it talks about fire descending from heaven. There are no mention of fire descending from heaven in this dedication service. But the people would have had Haggai's encouraging words. Again, if you go to Haggai chapter 2, verse 9, you see what he had to say about this particular thing. So he says the temple is going to be more glorious in the future than it had ever been in the past. That's what Haggai told them. Again, if you read Haggai, you're going to see a lot of the prophecies related to this process written there. It's a good read to tie in with reading Ezra. The number 12 for the goats. Let's talk about that for a minute. So we know that the people who returned from Babylon were of the members of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. That's what's recorded. But when they make the sacrifice for the sin offering, they made it for the 12 tribes. So obviously, they considered themselves a remnant of the original 12 tribes. So they kept that idea forefront in the process. So when they confessed sins and burned the goats, the scapegoats, they covered the 12 tribes. But it was the first time in, 4 centuries since the division of the northern and southern kingdoms under Rehoboam and Jeroboam that Israel had been able to worship together in one temple.
Jewish people would sin, and then they would offer a sacrifice after the sin had already been committed. And the whole thing that started this punishment, this being away or run out of Jerusalem, started with the 12 tribes of Israel when they divided and started.
Precisely correct.
So this is like covering all sins from when it very first started all the way up to the present.
Yeah, like Tommy said, this goes back to the separation of the northern and southern kingdoms and the split of the tribes. That's when this whole mess started. When that happened, that was the great sin, because what happened is those people that split off to the north didn't have anything to do with the people in the south. The only place you could make sacrifices was in a temple in Jerusalem. So any sacrifice that was made in the northern kingdom was not received well by God, if at all. So it was a sin. They couldn't offer sacrifices in Babylon because they weren't in the temple at Jerusalem. The only places that sacrifices were authorized to be conducted. So this 12 tribe harkens back to this whole mess started because 12 tribes couldn't get together.
Before they even discovered the foundation of the temple, they built themselves a sacrifice.
That is, because they would have had to make a temporary altar, but that had been done before. When Joshua crossed over, he built, temporary altars were built along the way. So yeah, before they even got started, when they got back to Jerusalem, they erected some kind of an altar of some kind and conducted, had a sacrifice to celebrate and thank God for the safe conduct they had on the journey from Babylon to Jerusalem. So that's a very good point. The idea here about divisions and things like that, what they're trying to do is get things back in order. Not an easy thing to do, considering where they had been. In other words, they had gotten so far from God that he allowed a foreign nation to come in, take them away to another country, out of Jerusalem, out of their homes, and everything else, and had them live in a foreign country. Now, I think that as they were dividing up the Levites and dividing up the priests, I wonder how easy it would have been to find qualified men, because they would have had to maintain their purity while they were in exile in Babylon. Or they would be men who would be born shortly before they came back to Jerusalem. The idea of finding all the qualified men to serve, I did a lot of research on that, and I think it would have been hard. It would have been hard. So, just a thought. So, it says on the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. This is the first Passover that was observed by a unified Israel in a very, very long time. Again, centuries. Go away. He says, and the rest of the return to exile celebrated the dedication. All right, so it said on the 14th day of the first month, returned exiles kept the Passover, for the priests and the Levites had purified themselves together. All of them were clean. So they slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles, for their fellow priests and for themselves. It was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by everyone who had joined them and separated himself from the uncleanness of the peoples of the land to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. And they kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, more joy, for the Lord had made them joyful, and they had returned the heart of the king of Assyria to them. Turned the heart of the king of Assyria, we'll talk about it in a minute. So that he aided them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. Now, how did the king of Assyria get stuck in the middle of this discussion? Well, I think what happened is it harkens back to the original separation. In other words, when they separated this group of people, what happened is that this concept, this was the guy that caused all these problems to start when he hauled all these people off. So I think that has something to do with it. You know, verse 20, when it talked about the Passover, they slaughtered the lambs as a service to the people and even the priests. So that had not been done before. And then I think there's a couple different groups of people here. I think there are Israelites, and I think there are people who joined the Israelites who would have not been considered clean, who would have had to go through some process to become clean, because they couldn't have in fact been in the temple proper if they were not. And so it could have been Gentile proselytes, ex-Canaanites, could have been Jewish backsliders who had lived there but hadn't done anything they were supposed to do. But it's just basically, I think, commenting on the fact that there was a cleansing process to get rid of the impure associations with heathen. There were probably still some other problems which we'll later talk about. But there would be foreigners embedded with the Israelites. That it just would have been that way. Kind of like in Exodus 12:38, where it talked about the mixed multitude. Well, the foreigners had already come in and messed things up to a certain extent. When Israel left Egypt, not everybody was Israelites. And you don't really understand that until you read a little more. So, and now the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, that's a continuation of the Passover. And the removal of the leaven from the houses really symbolizes a purging of all their old sins. That's the idea of that. In other words, they're basically wiping the slate clean. They want to start over, and so that's the purpose of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So we have that. Let me see if we can get. I got one more slide. Let's see if we get through that. Maybe. Basically, what it says here is that Solomon's dedication prayer in 1 Kings 8:22 to 53. In that prayer, Solomon mentions the northern kingdom. He says, and forgive your people who have sinned against you and all their transgressions that they have committed against you, and grant them compassion in the sight of those who carried them a captive. He's talking about the Assyrians, that they may have compassion on them. So basically, the idea of mentioning the king of the Assyrians here was the fact that God turned the hearts of the leaders who actually had conquered the Assyrians. So what he's really doing is saying the great sin that was committed by the king of Assyria has been resolved in the fact that Darius now looked favorably upon the Israelites. And so that's how Assyria gets stuck in here, my thought. But these people are exhibiting joy because they're keeping God's commandments. The temple itself, it's not in great shape. Another leader is going to have to fix that. And so it takes time and more than 58 years. So next week, we're going to stop talking about Ezra, and we're going to spend time in the 58 years because it fits chronologically. So we'll dig in a little more. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your bountiful blessings. We thank you for allowing us to gather here this morning and study your word. Father, we pray that the things that we do and say each day of our lives would be in accordance with your will. We ask, Father, that you would help us to share the news of Jesus with those we meet each day. Watch over us always. Ask, Father, that you'd be with those who are traveling this holiday season. Ask that you'd be with those who have lost loved ones. Bless and comfort them. We ask, Father, that you'd watch over us always. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you so much.